My name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Providence College. This is a lecture on economic instability, environmental degradation, and democracy, which is the subject of David Schweickart After Capitalism, Chapter 5. This is the sixth lecture in this series, and I encourage you to watch the other ones that go beforehand and the one that comes after this. In this lecture, we are going to talk about three primary issues: economic instability, environmental degradation, and democracy as threats to human flourishing that arise from capitalism. I will also spend a brief amount of time on the 2007-2008 crisis and our time looking back at that in 2020. So to begin, one of the causal features of capitalism is economic instability, which proves a threat to human happiness and flourishing. We might look at what is the cause of economic instability, and Marx talked about this in terms of the crisis of overproduction, which is a strange crisis to have for any economic system. Usually if you have overproduction, that is a good for most people, and if there's too much being produced, then people cut back on what they're producing, how much they're working. But in capitalism, things do not work that way because of the nature of wage labor. And to repeat what I've said in previous chapters, what Schweickart has said in previous chapters, wage labor is one of the primary features of capitalism and is considered a cost by capitalists. So the desire is always to keep wages down. Yet, on the other hand, the main consumers for the capitalist system are the laborers. So if you pay them less, what happens is they cannot afford the items that they make. We can see this in a number of present-day situations. So sweatshops in Southeast Asia, the people working there cannot afford to buy for example, the $90 sneakers that they are making. Or we've seen in the news in the last several years, people who work at Walmart, for instance, do not have enough money to supply their own foods, and many of them are on food stamps. So what happens is if people are not able to buy the materials, we have overproduction. And of course, if there's overproduction, profits drop, and so we cut employment, because what we want to do is cut cost, and wage labor is considered a cost. This, of course, means that fewer things are being sold because there's no one buying them, and we get even more unemployment. So this is one of the primary causes of economic instability and the typically 10-year crises in capitalism that we've seen in the last 300 years. Of course, one of the aberrations there is the post-war golden age from 1945 to 1973. And this had 5 features to it that helped prevent this economic instability for that period of time. First, the capitalists were investing in the real economy. There was investor confidence, and they were producing more things and investing in technology that allowed increased production. And so investments also enhanced productivity, which meant that the capitalists had a return on their investments. They saw their own profits increase. Overall production, in fact, increased as well, as we saw with the number of houses that were being produced, as well as cars and all the sorts of modern conveniences that we enjoy today. And at the time, wages were going up. Workers had enough money to buy things. This was in part because of the strong unions at the time, which have been decreased since then. And finally, workers must want to increase their production and buy those things that are being produced. And of course, people wanted to buy the cars, wanted to buy the houses. But in many cases, this means that people must be persuaded to buy those things. And so advertisement became a significant industry during this time period and really reached its prominence among capitalism during this time period. Today, what we rely on are lower prices, which means that capitalists are even more concerned about keeping wages down, which means that there's still an inability to buy, as suggested in the aforementioned Walmart case. Economic instability also happens when there are bubbles. And this is when we have too much investor confidence, as we saw in 2007, 2008. The economic crisis that happened then was because of a bubble, a housing bubble. Before that, we had a variety of energy bubbles, phone bubbles, tech bubbles. And this is when investor confidence is growing so much that they continue to invest to a point where they can no longer invest. Under either situation, we have four tools for economic recovery. We can group these in terms of monetary policy or fiscal policy. In relationship to monetary policy, there are two tools for getting the economy back on track. One is to reduce interest rates. And as we've seen since 2007, 2008, interest rates have been kept low, and our current president wants to reduce them to zero. And then to print money, which is a thing that we try to avoid because that increases inflation. Fiscal policy includes cutting taxes on anyone, but this means, of course, that we're running a deficit in the government. And then finally, we can create or expand government programs. I'm surprised that Schweickart has not talked about the reduction of government programs, actually, in the austerity programs throughout both the third world and the first world, with Greece, the United Kingdom, and currently with the United States. But those are four tools for trying to invigorate an economic recovery in the case of either investor confidence or a loss of investor confidence. If we are looking at economic democracy, on the other hand, there are tools for preventing these economic instabilities. First, the market is simply not as vulnerable to either investor confidence or over optimism. So investment doesn't go in relationship to production of objects, but it goes back into the local economies, which can support, of course, production of tools, but we do not have the same degree of problems because we don't end up producing so much that we have an overproduction that's going to hurt the economy. Speculative bubbles become impossible because financial markets are limited in what they can gamble in. So we wouldn't have a situation like the bubble around housing or around tech. And then we're not dependent on private investors to help correct the market. The protectionist ideas that we have that we've talked about in previous chapters prevents money from fleeing one territory and keeps jobs secure. And of course, economic democracy, the firms in those democracies are reluctant to take on too many workers, and they are reluctant to lay off workers. So unemployment becomes less of a problem in these situations. Now, just briefly to talk about the 2007-2008 crisis from the perspective of 2020, we have to remember that Schweickart was writing this book, revising this book in 2011, originally published in 2001, and we're looking at it 9-10 years on. And so some of the things that he says about the 2007-2008 crisis are true in his analysis of Keynes and the fact that the golden age of economy that we saw in 1945 to 1973 remains true. But we also have to remember that unemployment has been reduced since 2008, and we're at a low unemployment right now. But that is one of the things that we have to keep in mind as we go forward thinking about economic democracy. Further, what we know about the Golden Age are things that we cannot reproduce today. So during the Golden Age, people were having high wages, but today we do not have high wages. In fact, since 1973, wages have stagnated. And so if we want to ask, well, who's been making household incomes increase, it's been the entering of women into the workforce, which is added to that housing increase. But of course, that means less time with the children and more time on the road. Uh, if in this case wages have stagnated, who has been able to do the buying, right? It's consumers that keep the market going. And what we have noticed is, of course, household debt has risen and personal income has less discretionary advantages to it. So few houses have discretionary income in 2020. Moving on, we want to also think about environmental degradation. And I think Schweickart makes a nice a balance here between the good news and the bad news. The good news is that our basic problems have solutions that we've seen. We've taken care of overpopulation in a number of countries, including China, but also in the United States and Western worlds where fertility and population growth is negative or at zero. Food scarcity is a concern, but if we change our habits, we have enough food for everyone to go around. And in terms of pollution, we know that we can, in fact, stop pollution, but this means that we have to impose certain taxes, stop subsidizing fossil fuels, increasing, having strict emissions, and then underwriting green energy research. And that's where the bad news comes in. In relationship to the good news, the bad news is that we have resistance from corporations. So if we stop subsidizing the fossil fuel companies, the capitalists that own those fossil fuels are going to be resistant to that and going to prevent those kinds of subsidizations from being stopped. They're also going to try to prevent carbon taxes. Also, we notice that this comes with hard lifestyle changes for us. Eating less meat is a hard lifestyle change for many people. Driving less and taking public transportation is going to be a harder change for most people. And in fact, what we see in other countries is that Hollywood has presented this idea of the American way of life, of freedom and people driving around, which is not sustainable for the whole world. It's not even sustainable for the American population as we see today with the environmental crisis. And so the bad news is that people want something that we cannot have, and so we have to make changes to those desires. Of course, features of capitalism increase environmental degradation. So we have capitalism is expansionary. It wants to constantly grow. And there's, of course, a crisis tendency that we've already talked about. This crisis leads to overproduction, which means that many things are thrown away or stockpile. And then the mobility of capital is just unrestrained today, so that capital can move from country to country, region to region, so that if we try to impose carbon taxes or stop subsidizing fossil fuels, capital will get up and leave, and the economy in that particular region or country will crash. So, in short, an environmental POV requires cutting back on consumption, but capitalism, in fact, demands more and more consumption. And so, we cannot take care of the environmental crisis while living under a capitalistic economic system. However, economic democracy will allow us to take care of the environment and to have a healthier environment for people to reach happiness. So, economic democracy does not require economic growth for stability, as capitalism does. So, we might just have stable economic production without having growth. Second, the control of investment would be socially controlled, and so that social control can be scaled back in terms of material consumption. This is something that we don't want to do quickly. And the social control of investment will allow us to do a slow and steady scaling back of material consumption so that we do not harm the market and make it an impossible place to live. And the other thing is that this democracy will allow us to better invest in green communities, making bus routes better, making it easier to grow our own food, and do things that will make the environment healthier. Of course, economic democracy is a democracy, and people may choose not to pursue these environmentally friendly ideas, but presumably, knowing the risk, we will want to try to have a stable environment. Next, we want to talk about the lack of democracy under capitalism. And Schweickart makes a distinction between polyarchy and democracy. Polyarchy, a term invented by Robert Dahl, is a system in which a broad based electorate selects political leaders from competing candidates in elections that are reasonably honest. And mostly of what we see in the United States, United Kingdom, Europe, and other places is this kind of polyarchy. We have political leaders that we do select, but those leaders are chosen for us, and we only select between the choices given to us. And usually these elections are reasonably honest, despite what we hear in the news in the United States, although the threat to that honesty is increasing with Russian incursions. Democracy, in contrast, is a system in which a universal electorate is reasonably well informed, active, and unobstructed by a privileged minority class. So here we're talking about a suffrage that is universal among adults. We can all vote, and our electorate is sovereign, which means that members are well informed. We know what is going on, and we know about the policies and the proposals and possibilities, and we're informed about the facts. And we're active as well. Half of people in the United States did not vote in the last presidential election, and that's just under a polyarchy. So we would need much more engagement under a real democracy. And then no stable minority is privileged. And what we mean by privileged is that they possess some kind of political power that is equal to or more than that of the electorate. But of course, we know that there is a ruling class in the United States of capitalists who, even though they have some disagreements, have a similar education, have similar beliefs, and are committed to the expansion of capitalistic profit. They exercise their power through a variety of mechanisms. So there's no discussion of a deep state here because that's not what's going on. This deep state is sort of a fallacy, and what really is going on is the lack of campaign finance, so that billionaires can contribute as much as they want to candidates, and this, of course, makes candidates beholden to their ideas. Uh, uh, the 1% also provides foundations, private foundations, and think tanks that support their way of thought. And they control the news media, particularly by owning the news media. So that even though there are disagreements, there is a monopoly, in a sense, of ideas supporting capitalism. And one of the interesting things that Schweickart talked about is how there is no really left news media, Marxist news media in the United States. And that's just one sign that capitalism and the ruling class has dominated here. Under workplace democracy, though, democracy becomes much more vibrant. Of course, democracy is spread in the workplace. Decisions are made by the workers, and management is chosen by the workers. A less income inequality will make campaign contributions less weighty, so that people cannot simply choose or have policies imposed upon others because they're able to pay for those policies. Certain matters that arise within democracy do not arise within the polyarchy. So we would talk about different issues under democracy that are not talked about in polyarchy. And I recommend you look at Schweikart's discussion of those issues. And then finally, because the National Investment Fund is distributed locally, local politics and regional politics become much more interesting, and people will become much more involved because we're making decisions about our everyday lives. So again, we see three problems of capitalism caused by capitalism that economic democracy has resources for preventing. And thank you for listening.